welcome to Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. This week's episode comes from the Kolkata Literary Meet in India, and my guest is a stalwart of the literary festival. He's a podcaster and a columnist living in Kolkata. He hosts a radio show for Indian Express. His dispatches air every week on public radio in San Francisco, and his columns appear in Mint Lounge, The Hindu and The Times of India. He's also the author of the novel Don't Let Him Know, published by Bloomsbury. Sandip Roy, welcome to Meet the Writers. Now, we're recording this in the really beautiful botanic gardens here in Kolkata. Just describe where we are.
We're in a little bit of Eden in a city which is starved of green space mostly. So this is the agri-horticultural garden, which is over 200 years old in Calcutta, I think. And we are surrounded by all kinds of flowering trees. We can hear birds chirping, and occasionally flights of parrots will take off squawking. And in the midst of this, people are talking books. It's like you can choose to forget the world outside if you want to.
And we can hear also in the background a couple of sessions going on, because of course this is what it's all about, is talking books. Tell me how you got into talking about books. You're a writer, you're a columnist, you're a podcaster. You were born here in Calcutta.
I was born here in Calcutta. I grew up here. I did my education here. Then I went to the US to make a living, basically as a software engineer, and then sort of wandered into the world of books by accident, sort of reinventing yourself in America. It was writing and books was something I was always interested in, but for at the time in India, you didn't really see any kind of career possible in the world of books. It could at best serve as a hobby, as a side occupation that you passion, and you were told do something worthy, like become a doctor or an engineer or a chartered accountant, and you can always write on the side. And that's true, because if you studied English literature, most people, you could go into academia, teaching, but if you didn't want to do that, there wasn't a lot you could do. And my parents, like many upper middle class parents in Calcutta, it's not like they wanted to squash any creative genes, but they were nervous whether you could make a living by that, and so they gently nudged me towards computer science, and I ended up working there. But I realized at some point that my passion lay with writing, and as they had said, I started doing it on the side as a hobby, and eventually gathered up the courage to go into it full time and wandered into the world of writing and public radio in the United States.
Tell me how that began for you.
Oddly, it began for me right before 9/11 had happened. I had given in notice to my software job, and I was working, and I had decided to join this organization called Pacific News Service in San Francisco, which was founded by a MacArthur genius named Sandy Close, and they were sort of an alternative wire service. And one of the things they were doing was something called New California Media at that time, where they wanted to highlight the media that was non-English perhaps, or media that catered to different ethnic groups in California. So Spanish language, Chinese language, Indians writing in English for the South Asian audiences, because they realized at that time that the sum total of all their readers was actually more than the people reading the San Francisco Chronicle or the main sort of English language newspapers of the day. But nobody paid attention to these Chinese language newspapers. There were 3 Chinese language newspapers, dailies in San Francisco, at a time when 1 English language newspaper was struggling to survive, but 3 were survive. So I wandered into that, and I remember 9/11 happened. I hadn't yet joined the office, and 9/11 happened, and I was watching TV, and then I got a call from my software job, said that they were going to be closed for the day because of this terrible event that had happened. And my new upcoming job, they called me and they said, can you come in for an editorial meeting? And I'm like, oh, this is the new world I live in, where normal people are getting a day off because of this, but for me this is work now. And so that's how I started. And then then they started a radio show, and I was a guest on the first show. The host didn't work out, and they said, "Oh, do you want to try out as a host?" And I thought, "Oh, well, I've never done this before, so might as well try it." And I ended up doing it for about a decade and really enjoyed being on the radio.
I mean, you did over 500 episodes. Tell me what it is that you were doing on the radio.
So at that time, when I started it, I used to host a show called New America Now, which was sort of a variety, like a magazine format show, interviews with writers, speakers, but all targeted towards these different ethnic communities that were all over California, which was sort of the new America that was coming up. Because California at that time had just about switched to becoming a minority-majority state where no group was anymore over the 50% mark. So those were the stories coming out of their community and writers and voices. And then in 2011, I actually left US to come back to India, and at that time I stopped doing that show. And then my radio station in public radio station in San Francisco, KLW, suddenly called out of the blue and said, "Hey, we kind of miss having your voice on the air. Do you want to do like a weekly audio dispatch, like a little audio postcard from Kolkata for audience in San Francisco?" And I was like, "About what?" It's like, "It depends on you, about things you find interesting." And I thought, okay, I can try this. Maybe we can do 50 to 100 episodes a year or so's worth, year or two. And then somehow it became, one day I realized it was 500 episodes, and 500, they're like short 5-6 minute dispatches. Sometimes they're about a literature festival like the one we have here. Sometimes it's just a commentary on odd little things I see around me. The very first episode I remember was about how difficult it was to be unmarried in India, and in a country that is obsessed with marriage, and like how difficult it was to sort of navigate India as a single person. And I remember I taped this. We have these traffic signal lights that actually have audio with them, and so at that time they used to have a traffic signal that said, "Please watch for oncoming traffic, because remember, you have loved ones waiting for you at home." And I remember thinking, what if you don't have loved ones waiting for you home? Should you fling yourself in the path of an upcoming bus? But that was how. But I really enjoyed doing it, and 500 dispatches later, we're still broadcasting these weekly dispatches from Kolkata to San Francisco. And when I came to Kolkata, I had no radio studio anymore, which I was used to having. So I just had my recorder. Somebody who had been a war reporter told me how to go about it. He said, like, "Oh, just make a tent with your bedclothes, like a blanket, and go under the blanket, and then you can tape." And I did that, and it worked like a dream, except of course in the summer in India it becomes a little stifling, so I don't want to do too many takes.
I just want to circle back to the traffic lights for a minute. Could you give a Western audience some idea of the traffic in Calcutta? Because it's insane.
It's really hard to give an idea of the traffic in Calcutta because literally words cannot do it justice, only sound can. But it's like sea of traffic. It is like you would look at a road, and in a normal Western country or many places in the world, you're like, oh, that road looks like it should accommodate 3 lanes of traffic on each direction if it's a wide road, or 2 lanes. But in Calcutta, none of those terms are meaningless, because it will start out as a road that's meant for 3 lanes of traffic. But as soon as anybody sees a gap, they will try to fill that gap. So the 3 lanes soon become 6 lanes of traffic, which are cutting each other all the time, and everybody is trying to get an inch ahead of everyone else, and resulting in massive traffic jams. And then everybody presses on their horns and beeps really loudly and honks, and in some ways it's almost, and they get angry and they shout at each other and curse at each other. But there's also a certain amount of good humor, because everybody realizes that despite all the honking, nobody's going to get anywhere any faster. And I had a relative who would, like, if everybody honked too much, he would get out of his car and turn around and say, "What do you want me to do? Do you want me to fly over these people?" But the traffic, I mean, the thing is that these cities were not built to to accommodate the level at which the vehicular traffic has grown. And while the public transport has definitely grown, the cars have really multiplied in the city. And right now, I remember talking to a car dealer who said when sort of the international brands of cars started coming in, he realized the first time a prospective customer would go into a car dealership to check out a car, he realized the first thing they tried was the horn and how loud it was. And he said, I forget which company it was, but he said they actually had to make their horns louder because their horns were not loud enough to meet people's fancies.
Let's get back to your work and to literature. Tell me about books.
Well, I grew up as a sort of bookworm, but unfortunately, at that time when I was growing up, in Calcutta, we didn't have access to the world of books in the way people do now. So I grew up on a diet of the usual stuff that most kids of my generation, or even before or after me, who were reading English books would. So you would read for English, you would read Enid Blyton's adventures and Richmal Crompton's William stories, which I actually really enjoyed. And then eventually you graduated to whatever, your Nancy Drew's Hardy Boys, and finally your Agatha Christie's and Alistair MacLean's, and maybe a little bit of Neville Shute or somebody, A.J. Cronin thrown in. But and then unfortunately in India, everybody goes through an Ayn Rand phase, and everybody at some point has read Fountainhead and thinks they've discovered their sort of mantra for life, and then years later are very embarrassed about it.
It's so funny because growing up in Zimbabwe, this kind of ex-colonial reading experience is exactly the same.
Yeah, I mean, it's stunning because I think in a way that was Britain's greatest sort of, like, more than colonialism and things. Enid Blyton and people like Enid Blyton were far more effective as colonizers than anyone else because she literally colonized our imagination. And I actually defend her now because now she's fallen out of fashion here, and rightly so. But I actually defend her because to me it was amazing that this woman, like these, I mean, as a writer now, I marvel at a woman who could make potted meat sandwiches sound so delicious that I wanted. And then finally, years later, I go to England for the first time and I have scones, strawberries, and potted meat sandwiches, and none of them lived up to my expectation. The scones were dry, the strawberries were tart, and the potted meat sandwiches were really nasty. And I thought, this woman is remarkable. Like, all my life, I wanted to have a little picnic hamper and go to some cave somewhere and open it up and have my ginger beer and potted meat sandwiches like the famous 5 or adventurous 4. But now what's fascinating is that post the sort of Salman Rushdie and Arundhati Roy and Amitav Ghosh happening, you finally, when I read them, I realized that my experiences, my stories could also be part of literature. And it sounds like sort of hokey and politically correct and multicultural diversity and all of that, but I think it is important to be able to see your face in the mirror, as it were, in the books that you were reading, not because if you want to feel represented, but because you realize that, actually, my adventures in India could make for a good story in the same way as the famous 5 or 5 Find Outers did. And there were Bengali writers I was reading, even the great Satyajit Ray filmmaker. He had an immensely popular detective series that all kids grew up reading, or ghost stories and things like that. But we were reading them in Bengali, and in some ways we were bifurcating our world. So English literature meant certain things, Bengali literature meant certain things, and you could be sort of ambidextrous and read both. But those worlds were not supposed to really merge. And then finally, Amitav Ghosh writes Shadowlines, or Arundhati, right? And in fact, Shadowlines was really set in Kolkata. It was set in neighborhoods. Like, I was reading it and remember saying, this could be my street. And that is such a powerful feeling to think that was deemed worthy of publication, that your story it wasn't your story, but it was your story.
Yeah.
They were telling the larger story behind. And now it's an exciting time, because now the world of books has exploded. There are way more books coming out than one could keep up with. And it's great, but it's also a little, I mean, there is a bit of a nostalgic feeling in me where I think like, oh, I remember a time when these books were so few and far between, that when a new Amitav Ghosh came out, or a new writer, suddenly you heard like, oh, there's this woman called Jhumpa Lahiri who has written about Bengalis and immigrant stories in America. Everyone I knew like me had read that book. Now there are so many books out there that I can't keep up, which is a good thing, but it also means, I mean, and I'm all for it, but it's also a little sad. But at the same time, you also face that some of the old challenges never go away, whereas, while this world has opened up, you are constantly also, there's an effort to pigeonhole you into certain genres, certain things. So I remember, people, so you're instantly compared to, say, if you're writing about whatever, Bengali immigrants, and someone will come and say, oh, but Jhumpa Lahiri has already done that, which nobody would tell somebody that, oh, you're writing about white suburbanites in New Jersey, but John Updike has already done that.
Yeah.
Really, we can't have another book. So those habits die hard.
Tell me about your own writing.
I think I started out as a terrible Enid Blyton clone, because I was basically trying to write books. The first sort of long piece that I ever wrote was thankfully lost children novella kind of thing, which was all about, I loved this song called Puff the Magic Dragon by Paul Mary. So I wrote a novel based on this strong. But now I realize even though I was writing, and that was a little bit of Puff the Magic Dragon meets Tolkien. so whatever I was reading at that time would get into the work. But I realized in the end what actually drew me to it was the poignancy of that song, where in the end the boy grows up but the dragon doesn't, and the boy doesn't remember the dragon anymore. And I think as a writer, I've always been drawn to that idea of loss, which is one of Kiran Desai's famous book, Inheritance of Loss. There is an inheritance of loss, and I think I became a writer, even though I always liked to write, and in school I was doing the usual school magazine and all of that. I think what made me a writer was leaving India and going away to America and experiencing that loss for myself. And that made me want to capture it. I would one of the first stories that I wrote was really based on my great-grandmother, and I had the good fortune of living with her and seeing her until I was well into my teens. But there was a moment in America when I remembered, I remember her vividly, but I can't hear her voice anymore. I've sort of forgotten what she sounded like. And I wrote a story based on my memories of her and my mother and their constant altercations and fights. And my mother read the story and said, oh, I love it, but I wasn't that mean to your great-grandmother. And I was like, it's fiction. But that story eventually became part of my novel, Don't Let Him Know. And the way the novel happened was I was writing these short stories that were based on little vignettes and things that I remembered, and then somebody read some of them, and some were in first person, some were in third person, different characters. I was thinking of them as short stories, and somebody read them and said, you think they're all about different people, but you're really writing about the same 2 or 3 people at different points in time. And at first I was kind of aghast and said, what do you think? I'm such paucity of imagination that I've written 6 stories of all set in all, and they're all about the same people. And then when I calmed down, I was like, oh, it's true. And I thought that maybe I could embrace that and try and make a novel out of short stories. And that's how my book Don't Let Him Know happened. It was written, it's all about the same people, and every chapter is a self-contained short story, but together they add up to a novel, hopefully. And it's about family secrets. And there was a lot of the book is not at all autobiographical, but there's a lot of my autobiography in it, even though the story is not. And that was a way of, because I had a very happy childhood in many ways, but at the same time I always felt that that there's no really happy childhood. It's like the happiest childhoods, happiest families also have these secrets. And I loved this idea of writing a book where everybody had secrets, and some secrets were really bone-crushing and grim. But so, for example, there's a character in there who's hiding his sexuality and his attraction to men as man gets married to a woman. But then there are some secrets that are delicious and exciting, like a crush on a film star man who becomes a matinee idol, or the great-grandmother in there who is, as a widow, not supposed to eat fish and meat, but she can't get over her love for fish heads and crunching these fish heads, but that's her secret that she holds on to.
What's the piece of written work that you're most proud of?
A piece of written word that I think one that I am most proud of, and I'll change my mind when you ask me tomorrow, but the one that comes to mind, I was reporting on, it was a non-fiction piece that I wrote. I was reporting on elections in the hinterland of India. And it was like Mr. Modi was just about to come to power then. It was 2014. And this was prime Modi country. It was very heated and toxic. And I had this very Muslim driver for the car that had been hired for me. And I was actually nervous going into these very politically charged rallies where Hindu right leaders were shouting, and my very Muslim driver. And the Muslim driver was very Muslim in the sense that, he was very strict in his observances. He wouldn't eat at any of the roadside eateries because he only wanted to go to places that were halal. So oddly, we would only go to vegetarian places, and then at one point I remember him telling me about his sort of crushed love story about the woman he fell in love with, but he wasn't allowed to marry her, and then he left home and became a driver. He had an MBA or something. And then he asked me about, and what about you? Are you married or not? And I just said I wasn't married because I wasn't sure whether I could come out as a gay person to this very staunch Muslim man in the middle of a highway while we were driving. And then eventually I thought, he shared so much of his personal story. I feel like I'm giving him short shrift. And I said, no, I'm not married, but I have a partner, and it's a man. And for a moment I was like, oh my God, is he going to dump me on the highway now with my bags? Because we were driving to Varanasi where Mr. Modi is standing for election. And he drives for a few minutes, beats, and then he says, okay, well, at least you have somebody. And he says, we don't hurt anyone, do we, by who we love? And I wrote that into an essay, and I was just really proud of it because it completely upset my own notions about what this man was about. And I think as a writer, and so when you go around, we carry so much of our preconceived notions with us in our encounters with people. And sometimes you have to meet people, and when they really surprise you, you realize that there is actually hope in the world, that these story, and that story is something that's always been very, very important to me.
You're also involved with a publishing house.
I'm not really technically involved with the publishing house, other than but there's Seagull Publishing in Kolkata, which is a long independent publisher based out of Kolkata. They publish a lot of works in translation, European writers, French and German, they translate, and including Mo Yan, who won the Nobel Prize. They were one of Mo Yan's publishers in India, and everyone was like, oh my God, how is a publishing house based in Calcutta publishing these voices from around the world? I'm not actually involved with them, but I am involved as a sort of honorary editor for a queer list they put together with Bishan Samadar, who is an editor with Seagull, and I actually have a forthcoming book coming out with them, hopefully at some point soon, which I'm excited about.
You are a stalwart of this festival. Tell us how it's grown.
This festival has just like Topsy and Uncle Tom's Cabin just growed. Like you'd have no idea how it happened. It started out, it's been I think about a dozen years. It started out as part of the book fair in Calcutta, which is also a mega book fair. Thousands and thousands of people show up. It's the largest sort of non-trade book fair in Asia, possibly. I'm not sure, but it's just a fair which book lovers go to. Like they walk around from stall to stall. And I remember I would go there as a kid, saving up all my money before there were other ways to buy books. And I would go to the book fair because you got a 10% discount on anything you bought. And it would be this huge fairground with all these stalls. It was dusty. I would always have a scratchy throat by the end of it, and you could just rummage through books and piles of books. And at the last day they would have a giant book sale, which went and we would bring back all kinds of books, from story books to cookbooks. My mother would get cookbooks and all kinds of things. So this festival started out as part of that book fair. It would happen right in the middle of it. Then after a few years they moved to Victoria Memorial, which is probably the grandest colonial monument in Kolkata. It's like sort of a marble Taj Mahal style dome building to Queen Victoria. And it was always wonderful to have this festival where there would be, like this time we have writers like Bernardine Evaristo, or writers talking about colonialism and migration, sitting literally under the shadow of Queen Victoria and talking about these issues. And then this year it has moved to this lovely agri-horticultural gardens in the middle of Calcutta, and it has grown. It's like a 5-6 day festival that happens. It brings writers from all over India, the world, but it also has a strong section of writers who write in Bengali, because that is, I think, a very important thing we forget in India, where the English language writing garners so much of the media oxygen that you forget that India has so many other languages and rich literary traditions in all these languages. So there are Bengali editions as well as English language editions, and they have a gamut of the sessions run the gamut from, like today we're having one of India's most popular romance novelists coming, as well as we have Gerald Durrell's wife Lee Durrell coming to talk about the centenary of Gerald Durrell and My Family and Other Animals, which almost all Indian kids of my generation grew up reading. But at the same time we'll have people doing sessions on dystopian novels of the future. So it's a lovely mix of some amount of familiarity and nostalgia, but also the possibility to discover new voices and new writers you would not otherwise know of, but you stumble upon them because you came to listen to one book session and just ended up staying for another.
And at that, I can hear that the music started up. I think that's probably our cue to go to yet another party. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
Sandip Roy is the author of Don't Let Him Know, published by Bloomsbury, and it's out now. And my very big thanks go to the Coal India Kolkata Literary Meet. You've been listening to Meet the Writers. Thanks to my producer Steph Chungu, who also edited this episode. And you can download this show and previous episodes from our website, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.